Everyone thinks Hitler destroyed Weimar. History says otherwise. There is a version of history almost everyone knows. Germany lost the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated the nation. Hyperinflation wiped out the economy. The Great Depression pushed desperate voters toward extremism. Then Adolf Hitler appeared and destroyed democracy. Simple. Logical, easy to remember. The problem is, that's not how the Weimar Republic actually collapsed. By the time Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Germany's democracy had already been weakened for years. Its institutions still existed. Its constitution still existed. Its elections still took place. But the confidence that gave those institutions their strength had been disappearing one decision at a time. The collapse didn't begin with one election. It didn't begin with one speech. It didn't even begin with one economic crisis. It began much earlier, with military leaders refusing responsibility for defeat, with politicians struggling to build legitimacy, with citizens slowly losing faith that the rules still worked. Every crisis left behind something far more dangerous than economic damage. It left behind doubt. Doubt in government. Doubt in democracy. Doubt in the future. Those doubts accumulated for more than a decade. Each seemed manageable on its own. Each looked temporary. Each felt like an exception. Until one day, there was almost nothing left holding the Republic together. That's the part most history books rush past. They focus on Hitler. But Hitler wasn't the first crack in the system. He was the man who walked through a door that had already been opened. To understand why Weimar really collapsed, we have to stop asking why Germans voted for Hitler. Instead, we need to ask a far more uncomfortable question. How did one of Europe's most democratic constitutions become so fragile that a single appointment could bring the entire republic to an end? Because once you understand that answer, the story stops being just about Germany. It becomes a warning about how democracies actually fail. The republic that inherited a defeat it didn't create. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Germany faced a reality that millions of its citizens had never expected. For years, official propaganda had painted a picture of resilience. Newspapers continued speaking of victory. Military communiques remained optimistic. Most civilians believed the German army was still holding the line somewhere beyond the country's borders. Then, almost overnight, the Kaiser abdicated. An armistice was signed. The empire collapsed. To ordinary Germans, it felt less like the end of a losing war, and more like waking up inside an entirely different country. The shock wasn't simply military, it was psychological. How could a nation that believed it was still fighting suddenly be told that everything was over? If the army had not been destroyed inside Germany, who was responsible? Questions like these spread rapidly through a society desperate for answers. In moments of national trauma, people rarely accept uncertainty for very long. If reality feels too complicated, someone eventually offers a simpler explanation. And Germany was no different. The new democratic government faced an impossible challenge. It hadn't started the war. It hadn't directed the military campaign. It hadn't negotiated years of strategic failures. Yet, it became responsible for explaining a defeat it had inherited rather than created. That distinction mattered enormously, because legitimacy isn't determined only by what a government actually does. It also depends on what people believe. The Republic needed citizens to trust it before it had even begun governing. Instead, many associated it with surrender, not because of evidence, but because of timing. The old imperial system disappeared. The new democratic republic arrived, and in the minds of millions, those two events became inseparable. The first emotional memory attached to Germany's democracy wasn't hope. It was defeat. That emotional burden would shape almost every political crisis that followed, long before debates over reparations, long before hyperinflation, long before the Great Depression. The Republic was already fighting an invisible battle. It wasn't simply trying to rebuild a country. It was trying to convince millions of people that it deserved to exist at all. And that proved far more difficult than rebuilding roads, factories, or even an economy. Because once trust begins slipping away, facts alone rarely bring it back. The people who understood that best weren't the Republic's supporters. They were the men who had led Germany into defeat, and they were already preparing a story that would protect themselves while placing the blame somewhere else. the myth that saved the generals and condemned the Republic. History has a habit of rewarding the best story, not the truest one, not the most complicated, the one people most want to believe. Germany in 1918 was searching desperately for a story that could explain the impossible. How had one of Europe's strongest armies lost a war that so many believed it was still capable of winning? The honest answer was painfully complex. 4 years of attrition had exhausted the country. The British naval blockade had crippled supplies. American troops were arriving in overwhelming numbers. Germany's allies were collapsing one after another. Even the high command understood that victory was no longer possible. But that explanation required accepting an uncomfortable reality. The war had been lost on the battlefield. For many military leaders, that was unacceptable. Among the most influential figures was General Erich Ludendorff. For years, he had exercised enormous authority over Germany's war effort. By the autumn of 1918, he knew the military situation had become hopeless. Yet, instead of allowing the army to publicly carry responsibility for defeat, the High Command pushed civilian politicians to negotiate the armistice. On paper, it seemed practical. In reality, it changed the political future of Germany. The generals stepped into the background. The politicians stepped into history. When the armistice was signed, it was civilian leaders, not military commanders, whose names became associated with surrender. That distinction would prove devastating. It created space for one of the most influential political myths of the 20th century, the so-called stab-in-the-back legend. According to this narrative, Germany had never truly been defeated by foreign armies. Instead, the nation had supposedly been betrayed from within. Weak politicians, socialists, Democrats, civilian leaders who lacked the courage to continue fighting. There was almost no evidence supporting this claim. Yet evidence wasn't what made the story powerful. Emotion did. For millions of Germans, the myth offered something reality could not. It preserved national pride. Accepting military defeat meant accepting painful limitation. Believing in betrayal allowed people to keep believing their country had remained undefeated in spirit. That was a far easier truth to live with. The tragedy was that this myth didn't remain a private belief. It entered public life. It spread through newspapers. Political speeches repeated it. Veterans carried it home. Nationalist organizations embraced it. Little by little, the story became part of Germany's political culture. Every challenge facing the new republic could now be interpreted through that single lens. Economic hardship, proof that traitors had taken power. Political instability, evidence that democracy was weak. International humiliation, confirmation that surrender had never been legitimate. The republic found itself defending not only its policies, but its very right to exist. Every success became temporary. Every failure became permanent. Because no government can easily build trust while millions believe it was born from betrayal. Perhaps the cruelest irony was this. Many of the men most responsible for Germany's wartime failures emerged with their reputations largely intact. Meanwhile, the democratic government that inherited the consequences became the public face of national humiliation. The battlefield had ended in 1918, but the fight over memory had only just begun. And that battle would shape Germany far more deeply than the peace treaty that was about to arrive in Versailles. Versailles didn't destroy Weimar. It destroyed its credibility. When people search for the moment Germany's democracy was doomed, they almost always arrive at the same place. The Palace of Versailles. The 28th of June, 1919. The day Germany signed the peace treaty that officially ended the First World War. For generations, Versailles has been remembered as the ultimate humiliation. A treaty so severe that it supposedly guaranteed another global conflict. There is truth in that argument. The treaty forced Germany to surrender territory. Its military was drastically reduced. The country accepted responsibility for the war through the infamous war guilt clause. And reparations placed an enormous financial burden on an already exhausted economy. None of those measures were insignificant. Many Germans viewed the treaty as profoundly unfair. Even outside Germany, several observers questioned whether such harsh conditions would produce lasting peace. But here's the crucial distinction. A difficult treaty is not the same as a doomed democracy. History offers plenty of examples of nations surviving military defeat. Some rebuilt after occupation. Others recovered from economic devastation. Still others emerged from civil wars that were every bit as destructive. What determined their future wasn't simply the peace settlement itself. It was whether their political institutions retained enough public trust to guide the recovery. That was the challenge Weimar never fully overcame. For many Germans, Versailles wasn't just another diplomatic agreement. It became a symbol, a constant reminder of national humiliation. Every concession made by the Republic could now be portrayed as another betrayal. Every compromise with the victorious Allies became another piece of evidence that democracy served foreign interests instead of Germany's own. Nationalist politicians understood the emotional power of that message. They rarely needed to explain the treaty in detail. The word Versailles alone was enough. It evoked anger, resentment, humiliation. Those emotions became powerful political tools. The Republic found itself trapped. Rejecting the treaty risked renewed conflict with the Allies. Accepting it meant carrying responsibility for every unpopular consequence that followed. Either choice damaged its legitimacy. What made the situation even more complicated was that the treaty itself didn't remain fixed. Over time, reparations were renegotiated. Payment schedules changed. International diplomacy gradually reduced some of the original pressures. Yet public perception barely moved, because political memory rarely follows economic reality. Once people accepted the idea that Versailles represented permanent national disgrace, later adjustments mattered far less than the original emotional impact. The damage had already been done. The treaty became less important as a legal document than as a political narrative. And narratives can outlive facts for generations. By the early 1920s, the Weimar Republic faced an impossible burden. It had inherited defeat. It had inherited the peace settlement. And now it inherited the blame for both. Yet despite all these pressures, the Republic still survived. It remained standing, which tells us something important. Versailles weakened Germany, but it did not destroy German democracy. The greatest test was still ahead, because while politicians argued over treaties, a completely different crisis was quietly building inside Germany's financial system, one that would make the bitterness of Versailles seem almost secondary. Soon, money itself would stop making sense. When Germany printed money to save itself, there are few events in history more famous than Germany's hyperinflation. You've probably seen the photographs. Children stacking bundles of banknotes like building blocks, workers pushing wheelbarrows filled with cash, families carrying entire baskets of money just to buy a loaf of bread. Those images have become symbols of economic catastrophe. But photographs only show the ending. To understand what really happened, we have to go back several years earlier. Because Germany didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy its own currency, the crisis unfolded one decision at a time. The First World War had fundamentally changed the country's finances. Instead of paying for the conflict through taxation, Germany relied heavily on borrowing. Officials believed victory would eventually allow the defeated nations to cover much of the cost. It was an enormous gamble. When Germany lost the war, that assumption collapsed. The debts remained. The expected victory never arrived. Then came the reparations demanded after Versailles. Whether those payments were economically manageable has been debated ever since. What mattered politically was something else. Many Germans believed their country had been placed under impossible pressure. Every new payment felt like another national humiliation. Every financial demand fueled growing resentment toward both the Allies and the Republic itself. The situation became dramatically worse in 1923. After Germany fell behind on reparation deliveries, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, the country's industrial heartland. Coal mines, steel mills, factories. Much of Germany's productive capacity suddenly operated under foreign occupation. The government faced an impossible dilemma. Should it cooperate with the occupation or resist it? Berlin chose resistance. Workers throughout the Ruhr were encouraged to stop working. Railway employees refused cooperation. Civil servants ignored occupying authorities. Factories slowed or stopped production altogether. It became known as passive resistance. Politically, the decision made sense. Economically, it created a disaster. Millions of workers were no longer producing goods, yet they still needed wages. The government promised to support them, but tax revenues were collapsing while spending continued to rise. There was only one way to bridge the gap quickly. The printing presses began running faster. At first, the additional money seemed like a temporary solution. Officials believed the occupation would eventually end. Production would recover. The crisis would pass. Instead, each new round of printing made the currency weaker. Prices rose. More money had to be printed. That new money pushed prices even higher. Soon, the process began feeding itself. The German mark wasn't collapsing because one single decision had been made. It was collapsing because every attempt to solve today's emergency created an even larger emergency tomorrow. People rushed to spend their wages the moment they were paid. Shopkeepers changed prices several times a day. Savings that had taken decades to accumulate disappeared with astonishing speed. Money itself began losing its most important function. It could no longer store value. It could barely measure value. Eventually, the government ended passive resistance. A new currency, the Rentenmark, was introduced. Confidence slowly returned. The hyperinflation came to an end. From an economic perspective, the crisis had finally been contained. But its deepest consequences could not be measured by exchange rates or price indexes. Germany had stabilized its currency. It had not stabilized its people's faith. And once trust disappears, it rarely returns as quickly as money does. That invisible loss would prove far more difficult to repair than the economy itself. The day Germans stopped believing the system would protect them. When people remember Germany's hyperinflation, they usually remember the spectacle, the mountains of banknote, the endless strings of zeros, the wheelbarrows overflowing with cash. Those images have become some of the most recognizable photographs in modern history. But they also create a misunderstanding. Hyperinflation wasn't remembered because people needed more money to buy bread. It was remembered because millions of Germans discovered that everything they believed about security could disappear almost overnight. For generations, the middle class had followed a simple formula. Work hard, save consistently, plan for the future, trust the bank, trust the currency, trust the government. Those weren't just financial habits. They were part of a social contract. Citizens accepted responsibility because they believed the state would provide stability in return. In 1923, that promise collapsed. Families who had spent decades building savings watched them become worthless in a matter of weeks. Teachers, civil servants, office workers, shopkeepers, retirees living on fixed pensions, none of them had speculated in risky investment. None of them had gambled on financial markets. They had simply believed that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Instead, tomorrow erased yesterday completely. A lifetime of careful planning could no longer buy a week's worth of groceries. Parents suddenly realized that the money they had saved for their children's education had almost no value. Older couples who believed they had secured a peaceful retirement found themselves depending on relatives simply to survive. For many, the financial loss was devastating, but the emotional loss ran even deeper. Because money is more than paper, it represents trust. Every banknote is a promise that society will recognize its value tomorrow. When that promise disappears, people begin questioning every other promise as well. If savings could vanish, what about pensions? If pensions could vanish, what about contracts? If contracts meant nothing, why should anyone trust institutions at all? These questions spread quietly through German society. They didn't produce riots on every street. They produced something far more dangerous: permanent skepticism. At the same time, many Germans noticed something deeply unsettling. Not everyone suffered equally. People who owned factories, real estate, farmland, or foreign currencies often emerged in a far stronger position than those who had simply saved cash. Large debts became easier to repay. Property retained value. Some businesses recovered surprisingly quickly once stability returned. To many ordinary citizens, the crisis seemed fundamentally unfair. The people who had played by the rules had lost everything. Others appeared to escape with relatively little damage. Whether that perception was entirely accurate mattered less than the fact that millions believed it. Politics is often shaped more by perception than by statistics. When the Rentenmark restored stability, economists celebrated. Markets stabilized. Trade resumed. Confidence slowly returned to financial institutions. But confidence inside people's minds recovered much more slowly. The scars left by hyperinflation could not be measured by exchange rates. Years later, whenever politicians proposed new spending, many Germans remembered 1923. Whenever governments promised that everything was under control, many remembered how quickly control had disappeared before. The Republic had saved the currency, but it had failed to preserve something even more valuable: trust. And once trust is broken, every future crisis becomes more dangerous than the last. Ironically, just as Germany began rebuilding its economy, many believed the Republic had finally found stability. They couldn't have known that its most prosperous years were about to begin, or that those prosperous years rested on foundations far weaker than they appeared. The prosperity everyone celebrated was more fragile than it looked. By 1924, Germany had accomplished what many thought was impossible. The nightmare of hyperinflation had finally come to an end. The Rentenmark restored confidence in the currency. Prices stabilized. Businesses could once again make long-term plans. Factories resumed production. For the first time in years, daily life began to feel predictable again. To millions of Germans, it felt as though the Republic had survived its greatest test. The chaos of the early 1920s slowly faded into memory. A new chapter seemed to be beginning, and for a while, it truly looked that way. Berlin transformed into one of Europe's most exciting cities. Its cafes filled with artists, writers, architects, and musicians. Theaters pushed creative boundaries. German filmmakers gained international recognition. Modern architecture reshaped entire neighborhoods. The Bauhaus movement challenged traditional ideas of design and influenced generations of artists around the world. To foreign visitors, Germany appeared vibrant, confident, forward-looking. Even the economy seemed to confirm the optimism. Industrial production recovered rapidly. Exports increased. Factories modernized. Employment improved. International investors once again viewed Germany as a country worth financing. The Republic that had seemed on the verge of collapse only a year earlier suddenly looked remarkably resilient. Many historians later referred to this period as the golden years of the Weimar Republic, and in many respects, they were right. Germany genuinely recovered from one of the worst monetary disasters in modern history. But there was one critical weakness hiding beneath the surface. The recovery depended on money that Germany did not truly control. Through the Dawes Plan, international confidence slowly returned. American banks began lending enormous amounts of capital to Germany. Those loans financed new factories. They modernized industry. They stimulated investment. They also allowed Germany to continue making reparations payments without completely suffocating its own economy. It was an elegant financial arrangement. American money flowed into Germany. Germany used part of that money to pay reparations. Britain and France then used those payments to repay their wartime debts to the United States. The system appeared almost self-sustaining. As long as American credit continued flowing, everyone benefited. Few people questioned whether such a system could last forever. After all, prosperity has a way of making structural weaknesses invisible. When businesses are hiring, few ask where the investment originated. When factories are expanding, few worry about the source of tomorrow's financing. Success creates confidence, and confidence often discourages skepticism. That was exactly what happened in Germany. Behind every new factory stood a foreign loan. Behind every major expansion stood international credit. The Republic looked stronger than ever, but much of that strength rested on foundations beyond its own control. Germany wasn't simply rebuilding its economy. It was borrowing time. As long as overseas investors believed Germany remained a safe destination for capital, the system continued functioning almost effortlessly. But if that confidence ever disappeared, the consequences would reach far beyond financial markets. Because an economy built on borrowed capital can lose its stability far faster than it gained it. The tragedy was that almost no one imagined such a reversal could happen so suddenly. The cafes remained full. Construction cranes continued rising above German cities. Industrial output kept climbing. To most observers, the future looked brighter than it had in over a decade. Yet history often hides its greatest dangers during periods of greatest optimism. And in Germany's case, the event that would shatter this fragile prosperity wouldn't begin in Berlin. It would begin thousands of miles away, on Wall Street. The crash didn't create Germany's weakness, it exposed it. For 5 years, Germany had been living through what looked like an extraordinary recovery. Factories were expanding, exports were rising. Berlin had become a symbol of modern Europe. Foreign newspapers praised Germany's remarkable comeback. To many observers, the darkest days of the Republic appeared to be over. But prosperity has a dangerous habit. It can hide weaknesses so effectively that people begin believing they no longer exist. That was exactly what happened in Weimar Germany. The economy looked stable. The financial system appeared healthy. Political tensions seemed manageable. Yet beneath the optimism, one uncomfortable truth remained. Germany was still depending on money that came from somewhere else. Its recovery was tied to confidence abroad just as much as productivity at home. As long as American banks continued lending, the system worked. But that also meant Germany's future depended on decisions made far beyond its own borders. Then came October 1929. On Wall Street, panic spread through the New York Stock Exchange. Stock prices collapsed. Banks suddenly faced enormous losses. Investors who had eagerly financed projects across Europe now focused on protecting themselves. The flow of easy credit stopped almost overnight. For Germany, the consequences were immediate. American lenders began calling in loans. New financing disappeared. Businesses that had relied on constant access to foreign capital suddenly found themselves trapped. Expansion projects stopped. Factories delayed investment. Banks became increasingly cautious. Confidence, which had fueled the recovery for years, began evaporating. And confidence is remarkably difficult to replace once it's gone. The crisis spread with astonishing speed. Companies reduced production. Workers lost their jobs. Exports declined as international trade slowed across the world. Each month brought another wave of bankruptcies. Each closure pushed unemployment even higher. Soon, millions of Germans found themselves standing in unemployment lines. For many families, the timing felt almost cruel. They had survived the First World War. They had survived hyperinflation. They had finally begun rebuilding their lives. Now another catastrophe arrived before the previous wounds had fully healed. Despair returned. So did fear. And with fear came a growing willingness to listen to voices that promised certainty instead of compromise. This is often where the story becomes oversimplified. The Great Depression happened. Therefore, Hitler came to power. But history is rarely that mechanical. Economic crises do not automatically destroy democracies. Many nations experienced the Great Depression. Not all abandoned democratic government. The Depression created enormous pressure. What mattered next was how political leaders responded to that pressure. Germany still had choices. Its institutions still existed. Its constitution still remained in force. Nothing about the economic collapse made dictatorship inevitable. The Republic was entering another crisis, not its last chance, but perhaps its most important one. Because from this point forward, the greatest danger would no longer come from financial markets. It would come from the political decisions made in response to them. And those decisions would gradually transform temporary emergency measures into a new way of governing. That transformation, not the stock market crash itself, would ultimately decide the fate of the Weimar Republic. The Great Depression didn't end Weimar. Its leaders did. When the Great Depression reached Germany, the country faced the most severe economic crisis since hyperinflation. Factories closed, exports collapsed, businesses failed one after another. Entire industries slowed almost to a standstill. Every week, unemployment climbed higher. Every month, another family lost its livelihood. For millions of Germans, the optimism of the late 1920s disappeared almost overnight. The Republic now faced a challenge unlike anything it had experienced before. But economic crises, no matter how severe, do not automatically destroy democratic governments. They create pressure. They expose weaknesses. They force difficult decisions. What happens next depends on the people making those decisions. Germany still had options. Parliament still functioned. Political parties still negotiated. The constitution remained in force. The Republic was wounded. It was not yet defeated. Then politics began making the crisis even worse. In March 1930, Chancellor Hermann Müller resigned after his coalition government collapsed during a dispute over unemployment insurance. At first glance, it looked like another ordinary political disagreement. Coalition governments had fallen before. New coalitions had always replaced them. Many expected the same outcome once again. Instead, something different happened. President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning as chancellor. Brüning inherited an economy already in freefall. Tax revenues were collapsing. Government spending continued rising. Millions of unemployed workers needed assistance. Financial markets demanded stability. Every available option carried enormous risks. Brüning feared repeating the nightmare of 1923. Hyperinflation remained deeply embedded in Germany's national memory. To him, protecting the value of the currency became more important than stimulating short-term economic growth. His solution was austerity. Government spending was reduced. Public salaries were cut. Taxes increased. Social benefits were limited. The goal was simple: balance the budget, restore international confidence, prove that Germany remained financially responsible. From one perspective, the strategy appeared logical. From another, it proved devastating. As government spending fell, consumer demand weakened even further. Businesses sold fewer products. Companies laid off more workers. Unemployment continued climbing. Lower tax revenues forced additional spending cuts. The cycle repeated itself. Each attempt to stabilize the economy ended up shrinking it even more. Despair spread far beyond financial markets. People weren't simply losing jobs. They were losing confidence that anyone in Berlin understood how to stop the crisis. Moderate political parties offered patience. Compromise. Fiscale Discipline. Extremist parties offered something much easier to understand: someone to blame. Simple answers. Immediate action. For frightened voters, certainty often sounded far more convincing than caution. Yet perhaps Brüning's most significant legacy wasn't economic. It was constitutional. Unable to secure reliable parliamentary majorities, he increasingly governed through Article 48, the emergency provision that allowed the president to issue decrees without normal legislative approval. Originally, Article 48 had been intended for exceptional circumstances. Now it became part of ordinary government. Each emergency decree weakened Parliament a little more. Each bypass made democratic debate seem less necessary. Each exception slowly became the new norm. No single decree destroyed the Republic. No single decision ended democracy. But together, they changed how Germany was governed. The Republic was no longer solving crises through political consensus. It was beginning to rule through emergency powers. That shift would prove far more dangerous than even the Depression itself. Because once extraordinary powers become ordinary, it becomes much easier for someone far more radical to inherit them. By the time Hitler arrived, the Republic was already breaking apart. History often remembers the 30th of January 1933 as the day Germany's democracy ended. It was the day Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor. The image has become iconic. The crowds, the torchlight processions, the speeches, it feels like the moment everything changed. But by then, the Republic had already been weakened in ways that most people barely noticed. Democracy rarely disappears the moment an authoritarian leader takes office. It usually weakens long before that. The warning signs had been accumulating for years. Parliament had become increasingly divided. Coalition governments struggled to survive. Emergency decrees replaced normal legislation. Political compromise came to be seen not as strength, but as weakness. Each crisis made extraordinary measures seem a little more acceptable. Each exception became easier to justify than the last. Eventually, governing outside Parliament no longer felt unusual. It felt practical. That quiet transformation mattered more than many people realized. Because constitutions are more than words printed on paper, they depend on habits, on restraint, on leaders choosing not to use every power available to them simply because they can. Once those habits disappear, the written constitution begins losing its ability to protect itself. After Brüning came Franz von Papen. Unlike previous chancellors, Papen commanded almost no meaningful support inside the Reichstag, yet he governed anyway. Not through parliamentary majorities, through presidential authority. The center of political power continued drifting away from elected representatives. Many conservatives believed this was only temporary, a necessary response to an extraordinary crisis. They told themselves normal politics could return later. History is filled with governments making that same assumption. Few realize how difficult it is to return once constitutional shortcuts become routine. Then came another turning point. In July 1932, Papen removed the democratically elected government of Prussia using emergency powers. Prussia was not just another German state. It was the largest, the most influential. For years, it had remained one of the strongest institutional defenders of parliamentary democracy. Its removal fundamentally shifted the balance of power inside Germany. Perhaps most remarkable was how little resistance followed. There were legal objections, political protests, public criticism. But the constitutional order continued eroding without triggering the national response many expected. The Republic wasn't collapsing because people suddenly stopped believing in democracy overnight. It was collapsing because each individual step appeared manageable on its own. One emergency decree, one constitutional exception, one government dismissed, one election, one more compromise. None seemed fatal individually. Together, they slowly hollowed out the system. By late 1932, conservative elites believed they had finally found a solution to Germany's political paralysis. If Adolf Hitler could not be defeated politically, perhaps he could be controlled politically. They assumed his popularity could stabilize the country while experienced conservatives quietly directed government policy behind the scenes. In their minds, Hitler would be useful, powerful enough to attract voters, not powerful enough to dominate the state. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. They misunderstood not only Hitler, but the condition of the Republic itself. They believed Germany's institutions remained strong enough to restrain any individual leader. In reality, those institutions had already been weakened by years of constitutional shortcuts and political complacency. The safeguards they expected to protect the Republic had been steadily dismantled, one decision at a time, one compromise at a time, one emergency at a time. So when President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, the Republic did not suddenly become vulnerable. It had already been vulnerable for years. Hitler did not create that weakness. He inherited it, and once he stepped into a system whose defenses had already been stripped away, dismantling what remained became dramatically easier. That is why the fall of Weimar cannot be understood as the story of one man. It was the story of an entire political system that slowly lost the ability to defend itself long before its final collapse became visible. The real collapse happened long before, 1933. When people ask why the Weimar Republic failed, they usually expect a single answer. Versailles, hyperinflation, the Great Depression, or Adolf Hitler. Each of those played an important role, but none of them, by themselves, explains why Germany's democracy disappeared. History is rarely shaped by one event. It is shaped by a chain of decisions, one choice leading to another, one crisis making the next crisis harder to survive. Looking back across the entire story, a pattern begins to emerge. The Republic inherited a military defeat it did not create. Before it had the chance to earn public trust, it was already blamed for national humiliation. Then came the stab-in-the-back myth, allowing many Germans to believe democracy itself had betrayed the nation. Versailles deepened that resentment. Hyperinflation destroyed confidence in money. The Great Depression shattered confidence in the economy. Political paralysis weakened confidence in Parliament. Emergency decrees weakened confidence in constitutional government. Each crisis left behind something more dangerous than financial damage. It left behind less trust than before. And trust is far more difficult to rebuild than roads, factories, or even currencies. That is why the collapse of Weimar should never be understood as the story of a single dictator seizing power. It is the story of institutions gradually losing legitimacy, of citizens becoming exhausted by constant crisis, of leaders believing that temporary shortcuts could solve permanent problems. Again and again, extraordinary measures were treated as harmless exceptions. Just this once, just until the crisis ends, just until stability returns. Each decision seemed reasonable when viewed alone. Very few people believed they were weakening democracy. Many believed they were protecting it. That is one of history's cruelest ironies. Societies rarely abandon democratic principles all at once. They slowly become accustomed to governing without them. People stop expecting compromise. They stop trusting elections. They stop believing institutions can solve problems. Eventually, they begin searching for someone who promises certainty instead of procedure, strength instead of debate, speed instead of accountability. By then, democracy has already lost much of what made it resilient. The legal framework may still exist. The elections may still be held. The Constitution may still remain in force. But institutions cannot survive on paper alone. They survive because people continue believing in them. That may be the most enduring lesson of the Weimar Republic. Its democracy did not collapse because one man was extraordinarily powerful. It collapsed because, over many years, too many people stopped believing the system itself was worth defending. By the time Hitler became chancellor, Germany's democratic institutions had already been weakened by myths, economic trauma, political miscalculations, and repeated constitutional compromises. His appointment was not the beginning of the collapse. It was the moment the collapse became impossible to ignore. That is why the story of Weimar still matters today. Not because history repeats itself exactly, but because the forces that gradually weaken democratic institutions, fear, polarization, distrust, and the temptation of easy solutions, are not unique to one country or one generation. They are recurring challenges that every democracy must confront. And history reminds us that the greatest danger rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one compromise at a time. The Weimar Republic is often remembered as a warning about dictatorship, but perhaps that's the wrong lesson. The real warning isn't how dictators rise. It's how democracies slowly lose the ability to resist them. No single crisis destroyed Weimar. Not Versailles. Not hyperinflation. Not the Great Depression. Not even Hitler alone. It was the accumulation of years of lost trust, institutional erosion, and political decisions that gradually weakened the Republic from within. So here's a question for you. If you had lived in Germany during the Weimar years, what moment would have worried you the most? The defeat of 1918, hyperinflation, the Great Depression, or the growing use of emergency powers? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy documentaries that go beyond the simplified version of history and explore the deeper forces that shaped our modern world, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.